Hello everyone, and welcome to our video series on the ancient Egyptians. This video series is meant to help you guys understand a little bit more about this group of people that we're going to be studying in term 2, the ancient Egyptians. People who are incredibly fascinating. You guys need to know a little bit of the basics behind them, some information that's going to help you understand them a little bit better. So without further ado, we're going to dive straight in, go through some of the basics today, and just get to grips with this new topic. So, the first thing to know about the ancient Egyptians is exactly where they came up, which was, of course, along the River Nile. The Nile is in North Africa. It's a river that goes up from Ethiopia down into the lowlands of North Africa and then flows out to the Mediterranean Sea. It's also known as the longest river in the world. The civilization that the ancient Egyptians created started around 3100 BC and lasted until 332 BC, which is basically between 5,000 and just over 2,000 years ago. They were famous for a whole bunch of things, but mostly for architecture, culture, and their general advancement. They created a fascinating language. We can see it here. It's called hieroglyphics. They created monuments that have withstood the test of time, including the pyramids of Giza, which can be seen here rendered as CGI. They do exist. And temples, such as this temple, which was a school of alchemy, that shows just how able they were with architecture and with building generally. Very skilled builders, very skilled engineers. But why do we bother studying them? That's a good question. One of the biggest reasons we look at the Egyptians as a group of people through history is that they're still mysterious and they're still exciting despite of how much we know about them. There's a whole bunch about the Egyptians we still don't understand. How they built the pyramids, for example, a monument you guys are going to see and understand much better in future videos. We still don't know. We still don't get it. We still don't get how they dragged massive tonnages of carefully built brick to create these pyramids. We don't understand a lot about them as people despite of how much we know about them. They left behind a whole bunch of stuff to help us know about them. The environment of North Africa is really good for preserving things, and it preserved a whole bunch of not only their monuments, not only the objects they used, but also, through the process known as mummification, people. And they, of course, had a huge influence on world history. It's kind of hard to overstate just how big. Suffice it to say, fairly massive. They influenced not only belief systems and ways people lived their lives thereafter, but also history of things we're going to be studying later in the year, not least of which being the ancient Romans. And one of the biggest reasons we can learn about them and we know so much about them is because of this thing called the Rosetta Stone, which taught us their language by translating ancient Egyptian into ancient Greek and then ancient Greek into basically English today. We knew ancient Greek, we didn't know ancient Egyptian, so through the ancient Greeks we learned the ancient Egyptian language, and that's helped us understand them so much better than would have otherwise been the case. There are still civilizations whose languages we don't know. We've discovered lots of things about them, but without their language, there's not a lot we can do with that. Now, it's important to look at how all of this began, this group of people living along the Nile and creating a civilization that lasted something like 3,000 years continuously. Well, the story starts earlier than 3000 BC. Around 8000 BC, which is almost 10,000 years ago, crops were domesticated. Things like wheat, barley, rye, and the early peoples of that time used these things, as they still do, to create things like bread and cereals. These staple crops, of which there are about 12 or 13, still constitute about 75% of our diet. So 75% of the stuff you eat is still made up of the things that were first domesticated about 10,000 years ago. Then thereafter, pretty much around the same time, people domesticated animals too. Things like cows, like oxen, horses, sheep, and others. About 10 or 11 different animals that basically replaced human muscle power with animal power, meaning they could push or pull things instead of us and much stronger than us. but also things that would then provide wool, meat, milk that helped expand our diets. When you put these two things together, domestication of plants and animals, what you get is something called the agricultural revolution that basically created human civilization as we know it. It expanded how much and the range of foods that we could eat. It basically expanded how much people could grow in any one piece of land and how much food they could get from that land. And that allowed there to be a lot more people, which gave rise to things like cities, from where we get the word civilization. So the rise of civilization, we're talking about a period of time that starts about 3500 BC, where we get the first actual cities. Before that, people lived in very small villages, very small settlements, between 100 and 500 odd people. But by 3500 BC, you get the first towns and cities that we can start talking about as fairly big places that had thousands of people in them. Now, this whole process starts in what is today the Middle East, in a place called the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent gave rise to the civilization of Sumeria, of Babylon, of Assyria, and a whole bunch of others over time. But these civilizations built the first cities, and over time their skills, their expertise, and their ways of harvesting crops expanded a little bit to the west, to a place called Egypt, through the Sinai Desert, especially along the River Nile. So the first peoples who domesticated crops came from the Fertile Crescent and expanded their knowledge to the Nile River Valley, giving their knowledge to the people there, and over time those people became civilized themselves. So that got us to ancient Egypt. It became a civilization by about 3200 BC when Upper and Lower Egypt were united by a guy called Menes or Narmer. We're not actually sure about that one. That's one of the mysteries that still remain from the period of ancient Egypt. But by 3200 BC, we're talking about one country ruled by one guy called a pharaoh. And that country left an imprint that we are still studying today in world history. A fascinating place, a fascinating people. And over the next 8 weeks or so, you guys are going to learn a great deal about them. And you're also going to be doing some work on them, some assessment to come, which we'll talk about later. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the term.